Hello, this is Jason Pichel, and this is my Fall 2021 CME project. So my big question is, what is the American identity? And why I ask this question? I think it's an important thing to ask because we need to figure out how other people within this country see themselves, see others, and see how they fit into that system of how we work together. And the way in which I'll get this answer is I had 10 people who I interviewed. I asked them 3 questions, and then I compiled their results, and within this presentation, I'm going to sort of review those results. The IS courses I used were first American Gothic literature. I chose this because we learned throughout analyzing American Gothic literature that you could really see the identity of early America within this literature, their fears and what they strive to be. So I thought that'd be an important thing to take inspiration from in asking these questions. The second course I used was Food, Culture, and Anthropology. The reason I did this one is because it didn't look only at America, it looked all over the globe. Parts of Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, not Australia. This didn't look so much at what people read for their identity, but what they ate, how they prepared their food. So I think this also gives me another insight on how culture and identity works together, and I thought this would be useful to figure out my big question. And the third IS course is Modern British Imperialism. I thought this would be another class that's important on identity, and this somewhat relates to the American identity, as the British founded the 13 colonies initially. But there are some parallels that I've noticed in this class, as well as through asking my questions. So the interview questions I had were, first, how do you identify primarily? And I left it open so that people could give their genuine answer. I didn't want to force it one way or another. I wanted, when they hear that question, them to say the first thing that comes to their mind. And I'm also looking for multiple things. I'm not looking just for one thing, but if they primarily identify as 2 things, I think it's important to include both of those things. The second question was, are there communities that share your identity? And again, I sort of left this vague. I didn't want communities to imply something institutionalized. I didn't want it to imply something small or something large. A community can be a group of just, 5 friends, and it can also be a large institution that gives scholarships. Those are all examples of communities. And I wanted to see if people felt they had a community that shares their identity, because that really shows both if they think their identity is valid or if they think others see their identity as valid. And again, how that fits in the whole American perspective of things. And the last question I asked people were, do you think others identify similarly to yourself? And this is sort of related to the prior question about, do you think there are communities that share identity? If they didn't outright say that in the previous question, I wanted to sort of drag that information out of them to see if they related to others, even if there wasn't a community they could pinpoint. As I mentioned before, I interviewed 10 people on this topic, and if you're counting up the numbers right now on this chart, you'll see that it adds up to over 10. And this was, like I said before, because I wanted people to be able to say multiple forms of identity. If someone identifies both with their job as well as their gender, I think that's an important thing to mention. And I think the first and most obvious thing that both primary duty/occupation and ethnicity and race got 5 tallies each. And the reason for that is when I asked this question, people mentioned that, and also a second way that they identify. That is something that's important that people mention, but there is also another way in which people identify. And the second obvious thing is that 2 people provided no answer whatsoever when I asked this question, how do you identify primarily? It took sort of a minute, and then in the end they said, this, I guess. And if someone says, maybe this, I wouldn't really call that an identity. I would call that, oh, I have to answer this question. So I thought it was important to mark down that 2 out of 8 people didn't have an identity, or they didn't want to identify with an identity at all. And now moving on to the results of the question, is there a community for your identity? I'm sure what may be shocking to you as the viewer is we had 2 people who said no answer for what is your identity, yet we have 10 people saying yes, there is a community for my identity. What I think this is related to is perhaps those 2 people who couldn't conjure up an identity do have things they identify with, but they don't want to say it's their whole being, their whole identity. Being a musician may be something fun to you, something important to you, but it might not be your identity. And for the last question, I couldn't really put this in a graph of any sort, so I just put the answers to the question of, do you think others identify similarly to you? And variations on these 3 answers were all that I got from the people I interviewed. There's no one just like me. For parts of my identity, yes, and there might be someone who closely identifies with me. So what I think is significant about the answers to these questions is you'll see that they're practically the same answer. I'd like to begin with the flaws in my research, and I think one of the most obvious ones is I only interviewed 10 people. And if you're trying to figure out the identity of an entire country of 320 million people, 10 people is a pretty poor sample size. Another question I asked that I didn't include in the initial results of this research: how do you see the American identity? Or what is the American identity? And largely what people said as their answer to this question was that either there isn't an American identity or it is incredibly unique. And speaking of that, lastly, the myth of the American identity is just that. Perhaps, yes, we all have a social security number, but there's no one identity that every American holds. I don't think I will continue with this research, at least not with this exact question, because perhaps I was asking the wrong question. But for all intents and purposes of this project, the conclusion I have come to through my research is that the American identity is incredibly unique.